She was the largest ship on the Great Lakes, a mountain of steel, built to outlast any storm Superior could throw at her. In one catastrophic night, she vanished from radar. 29 men went down with her, leaving only questions behind. November 10th, 1975. This is the forensic case file on the ship they called the Titan of the Lakes. At 729 feet, she was the biggest freighter ever built for the Great Lakes, a record she held for over a decade. The official record calls it a storm. The forensic record, sonar scans, wreckage angles, radio logs, tells a stranger story. She left port on a Sunday afternoon. The forecast called for a strong gale. No one predicted what that gale would become. By evening, the National Weather Service upgraded the warning. Winds were climbing past 50 knots and still rising. The Fitzgerald was in radio contact with another freighter nearby, the Arthur M. Anderson, tracking the storm together. The official logs state both captains agreed to alter course north, seeking shelter along the Canadian shoreline. But the sonar data recovered decades later shows something the captains never logged, a shallower route than either ship should have taken. Investigators later traced the Fitzgerald's path directly over 6 Fathom Shoal, a known hazard, marked on every chart of that decade. If she scraped that shoal, even lightly, the damage might never have been visible from the deck above. By mid-afternoon, McSorley radioed the Anderson with a report: a fence rail down, 2 vents lost, and a list to starboard. A ship taking on water usually corrects itself. The Fitzgerald's pumps were running constantly and never quite catching up. Some investigators point to the hatch covers themselves, clamps that may have already been damaged from an earlier voyage. If those hatches weren't fully sealed, every wave that crossed the deck could pour straight into the cargo hold below. Witnesses aboard the Anderson later to storm, producing something sailors call the Three Sisters, a set of 3 massive rogue waves in sequence. The first wave swamped her deck. The second followed before the first had cleared. Then came the third. Radar aboard the Anderson showed the Fitzgerald simply losing speed, as if she were carrying far more weight than she should. At 7:10 p.m., McSorley radioed the Anderson one final time. His words were recorded exactly. "We are holding our own." 10 minutes later, the Anderson's radar showed no return at all. The Edmund Fitzgerald had disappeared without a single distress call. No mayday, no flare, no lifeboat ever launched. 29 men vanished in the time it takes to read this sentence. She now rests in 2 pieces, 530 feet down, split clean across her midsection. News of the sinking reached shore within hours. No wreckage was found floating. No survivors were ever recovered. A Coast Guard investigation opened within weeks. Its early finding placed the blame squarely on the hatch covers, nothing more. But the crew's own union rejected that finding outright, arguing the report ignored a much larger structural question. For decades, that's all anyone had: a last position, a missing crew, and a cause the record couldn't fully agree on. That began to change in 1976, when the U.S. Navy's own submersible confirmed the wreck's exact location and condition. The sonar showed something Coast Guard's hatch theory couldn't explain. The ship had broken apart on the surface, not on impact with the bottom. If she broke apart before she even reached the bottom, the failure had to have started somewhere in her steel, not just her hatches. Later dives in the 1980s and 90s used the same forensic imaging tools now common on ocean shipwrecks and found new cracks. Metallurgists studying recovered hull fragments found a steel alloy more brittle in cold water than engineers of 1958 had accounted for. The official record states hatch failure. But the metallurgy, and the way she broke, points towards something more fundamental. Here is the pivot. If the hull itself was already weakening, the storm may not have caused the disaster. It may have simply finished it. Some engineers now argue the ship had been quietly hogging and sagging for years, flexing under repeated heavy Great Lakes cargo runs. Fatigue like that doesn't always show on the surface. It hides in the steel, until one storm asks for more than it can give. The debate became one of the longest disputes in Great Lakes maritime history, a fight over whether human decisions or ship design failed first. Some blame the shoal, some blame the hatches, some blame the steel itself. The full truth may require all three at once. Search planes combed the lake for days. Not one body was ever recovered from the water. Here's the contradiction nobody expected. The ship that couldn't be saved would later be visited by divers nearly every decade since. Families of the crew were split. Some wanted the wreck left undisturbed as a grave. Others wanted answers brought to the surface. In 1995, with the crew family's blessing, divers recovered the ship's actual bronze bell from 530 feet down. That bell now hangs in a maritime museum on Lake Superior's shore, replaced on the wreck with one engraved for all 29 names. Every name on that bell is a fragment of one storm, a night when a record-holding ship simply ran out of margin. McSorley stayed at the helm to the end. Naval tradition remembers him as steady under pressure. Critics ask why the course was never changed sooner. A memorial bell tolls his name every November at Mariners Church in Detroit, alongside the other 28. Modern sonar has now mapped both broken sections of the hull down to the inch. Detail the 1975 inquiry never had access to. And that detail confirms the ship split apart in a single sudden event, consistent with a hull already near its structural limit. The Anderson's final radio contact with the Fitzgerald remains the last human record of her afloat. 6 words, then nothing. "We are holding our own." A confident answer, sent minutes before the ship that said it ceased to exist. So which was it? A rogue wave? A scraped shoal? A failed hatch? Or steel that had been quietly failing for years? The official record still leans toward hatch failure. The forensic record suggests it was never just one thing. Every fragment recovered from that wreck carries 2 stories: the storm that history remembers, and the failure history still argues about. Some call this loss an act of nature. The metallurgy suggests otherwise. The Coast Guard's own report was never unanimous. 29 names are still read aloud every year at Mariners Church. Their families never got a single clear answer, only a storm to blame. And that may be the more troubling finding. A disaster remembered as nature's fault, when the steel itself may share the blame. The wreck still lies, exactly where the Navy's sonar first confirmed it, a steel monument to a night the records still can't fully explain. The wreck was found. The bell was recovered. The reason 29 men never made it home is still being argued today. So we ask you, was the Edmund Fitzgerald a victim of the storm, or of a ship pushed past its limits long before that night?